All right, so hello and welcome back. So, been busy this couple of last few days, is why there's not been that many videos, but we should be back on track, kind of. So, I thought we would do today would react to the Soviet leadership of World War II, Genius or Insanity by the Armchair Historian. I know the videos have been out for quite a while. Haven't watched it yet, though, so I'll give you my reactions to it. Soviet leadership during World War II? It's going to be iffy, and then also good at the same time, so let's get to it.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. The strategy of the Red Army during the Second World War is one of the most analyzed, yet misrepresented topics in history. Films and games often portray the Soviets mindlessly throwing themselves against their enemies, and ordered to be shot by their own officers if the men refused orders. These myths were primarily perpetuated by German officers seeking to slander their enemies, and in this video, we'll analyze both the highs and lows of Joseph Stalin's war effort, how he both helped and hindered his nation, and how his commanders performed under his leadership, if they weren't already dismissed.
So yeah, there's a lot of history in that 47 seconds right there. So the myth that the Russians were just throwing bodies, the Soviets, were throwing bodies at the problem, and then their own officers and people would shoot them if they ran away. Now, that is just not true usually on the whole. However, it requires more, delving deep into the history. So, the Soviets had these things called blocking detachments. Now, the morale of soldiers was not very good because they were losing a fuck ton in 1940 and 1941, again. And they had to get the bodies that weren't really that well trained to their assigned duties for the motherland. Now, if these units started to run away or falter, which they sometimes did, these blocking detachments of, I believe they were the NKVD, I could be wrong, they could just be regular army guys or military police, probably military police. Their job was to just turn them around. Be like, if they had a soldier coming at them, they'd be like, stop. I need you to turn around and don't dishonor yourself and just keep going. Okay? Don't turn around and run away. We need to stop that. They very rarely would shoot people, ever. Usually at the worst, they'd arrest them. Maybe send them to a penal battalion. At the very worst possible case, maybe shoot them. But 98% of the time, it would be enough to turn the guys that were running away around. And that's what they were used for. Second, the NKVD definitely had, our commissars were in squads and definitely platoons and upper leadership with an officer. Their job was to instill political speech and more morale for soldiers, and occasionally schwack the officer if they thought, they weren't doing their duty. Now that's fair game. But usually people, fun fact, of their own side don't like killing each other. There's exceptions to that, but so I'll see you there.
The USSR inflicted 10 million casualties on Germany, plus 1 million casualties on German allies and client states.
Now that is very crucial and key. There is always the saying that the Soviets lost 20, 30 million people, probably more, let's be honest with ourselves. But they definitely inflicted a hell of a lot of damage on the Germans with 10 million casualties just on the Germans. Now again, Germany was not that popular. Its population was nowhere near what the Soviets were. So that is disproportionately affecting their population. If I remember correctly, it was 8.5% of their population died in this war. That's civilians and military deaths too. So it was a massive toll for Germany.
75% of all German casualties were inflicted by the Soviets, including the losses of 48,000 tanks, 167,000 guns, and 77,000 aircraft.
Now, I've had some people argue with me in the comments already, and I just kind of fucking ignore them, honestly. But look at the casualty numbers don't lie. 75% of the German soldiers were casualties on the Eastern Front. That means 25% were everyone else. That includes the United States and Great Britain. Now, people have argued, stupidly, that Lend-Lease, I have seen this, saved the USSR. The funny thing is, our Lend-Lease didn't arrive until 1943. And by my calculations, Stalingrad was happening in 1941 and 1942. So when the turning point happens, our Lend-Lease didn't get fucking there because we weren't involved until the war until around 1942, really, because we got bombed in 41 December, and we came in January, but we still didn't have a lot of guys out. So again, the Soviets were going to win this war. How long that took, that is a different question. And does the war ending look the same? I don't know. But just the sheer amount of material and people they had versus German material and their allies, it was not even a contest that they would eventually win in a prolonged, protracted war.
7,000 aircraft. On the other hand, Soviet military casualties were around 16 million, with another 16 million civilian deaths. Of these figures, Germany suffered around 3 million killed in action to the Soviet Union's 8 million killed in action, an unbelievable 14% of its total population. Of all the powers involved in the Second World War, the USSR not only suffered by far the highest losses, it also suffered a far higher proportion killed in action as a direct result of the conflict. Yet despite this colossal body count, the USSR not only emerged victorious, but went on to become a global superpower. To explain how the Soviets could simultaneously suffer such losses, yet still somehow be on the winning side, we will first explore its leadership, then move down the chain of command to see how individual war strategies were implemented. All power within the USSR was centralized around a single figure, Joseph Stalin.
Before we continue with Joseph Stalin, I'm going to back it up a second. The casualties were 32 million just by this estimate. Around 30 is what they say. It could be definitely be higher. I would even go higher than 32. Now, there were several cases in which people didn't need to die. Let's put it that very simply. People didn't need to die. An example would be the siege of Leningrad. Could have let the civilians evacuate. Stalin thought the people would fight harder. The soldiers would fight harder if the civilians were there, instead of evacuating the civilians. So they were stuck there and starved to death. There's a lot of those kinds of things that the Soviets did. Their body count did not need to be as high as it was. However, it still would have been astronomically high compared to Western standards, but it didn't need to be as high as it was.
Individual war strategies were implemented. All power within the USSR was centralized around a single figure, Joseph Stalin. Not a single decision was made without Stalin's approval, either directly or indirectly. Notoriously paranoid and suspicious, Stalin entered the Second World War having just spent 3 years conducting the infamous Great Purge, which saw over half of the officers in the Red Army imprisoned or killed. But while some genuinely seditious elements were exposed, the purges also spilled an ocean of innocent blood, totaling at least 700,000 army personnel and 60,000 high-ranking officers.
Now, he's going to probably talk about how this decked the army, and I cannot underestimate how much this fucked the army. This took 1936 to 1938 as the Great Purge. The Soviets get attacked in 41. 60,000 high-ranking officers get yeeted, and just all officers all the way down. And then even a lot of these soldiers, NCOs and whatever. You can't train a new cadre of high officers, like the guys that fucking lead divisions and corps and armies and army groups, in less than 3 years. Really, it's not possible. Now, there's going to be a lot of promotions, but those guys don't have the experience required to lead those such big divisions, and they're also scared as fuck to disobey orders and think on their own initiative, because the people that were just in that position did that and they got fucking killed. So, this Great Purge is going to be a lot of what happened, what's wrong with the Soviet military, let's put it that way. What's wrong with the Soviet military in 41.
And 60,000 high-ranking officers. Stalin was obsessed with ideologically purifying his nation of all non-Soviet influencers, even if that meant killing men deemed too intelligent to make reliable underlings. These murderous prejudices deeply affected the Soviet military doctrine, as many officers were killed simply for proposing changes influenced by capitalist thought processes. Promotion relied on adherence to proper communist ideals, while any demonstration of genuine talent or leadership ability amounted to a death sentence. Surprisingly enough, at the same time the Red Army was suffering through the worst of the purges, it was also seeing an unprecedented period of growth and rearmament. While historians have frequently debated Stalin's motives and geopolitical outlook during the 1930s, the majority agree that he foresaw a major conflict within the next decade, and he had no intention of presiding over another disastrous defeat.
That is true. The Soviets knew a war. Everybody fucking knew a war was coming. Most people thought it'd be in 44. So they started gearing up. They didn't expect it to happen in 39. Nobody expected it to happen in 39. Maybe Hitler did, but I don't even think he fucking did. And again, this destroyment of your high command, you don't have any doctrine, you don't have any guys thinking outside the box. It just leads to problems all the fucking way down the chain. And yeah, it's just going to be bad.
Of presiding over another disastrous defeat. This illustrates the strange dualistic nature of Stalin's war preparations, which saw him pouring vast resources into the military while simultaneously ripping out its teeth to ensure it couldn't be used against him. Stalin also actively courted the attention of Adolf Hitler. Several high-ranking defectors have claimed Stalin believed a new world war would trigger socialist uprisings in Europe, which the USSR would sweep to the aid of. Others have claimed that Stalin couldn't care less about international socialism, but instead wanted to recapture the various czarist territories that splintered from Russia during the revolution. Still, others believe Stalin held Hitler in very high regard, considering him a kindred spirit thanks to their shared authoritarian values.
And all three of these things can be true at the same time. He might have been wanting to spread social revolution. He definitely, for a fact that I fucking know, wanted to restore not the Russian Empire, not in that sense, but in the sense of how territorially big it was and self-sufficient. And, the authoritarian. They got along, Hitler and Stalin, and trust each other, but it's a different fucking story.
High regard, considering him a kindred spirit thanks to their shared authoritarian values. Regardless of Stalin's real motives, he planned on keeping the USSR out of conflict until it was ready to fight an offensive war sometime in the 1940s. Thanks to his close diplomatic ties with Nazi Germany, Stalin gained the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August of 1939, which included a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe between the two powers. After war broke out in September, the Red Army moved into the eastern half of Poland with little resistance. Stalin then turned his attention to Finland, whose administration contained many White Russian exiles. After Finland refused to cede its border territories and join the Soviet-led bloc in the Baltic, Stalin ordered an invasion, only to witness his handcrafted Red Army take nearly 4-to-1 casualties against the determined Finnish defenders. Confronted with a butcher's bill of nearly 170,000 men, Stalin was forced to sit down with his top military commanders and begin inquiries into analyzing the disaster.
Okay, so there's a lot of shit to cover. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Poland. That is a thing. They both agreed. And when the Russians moved in, they fucking shot everyone, just like the Germans did. They shot all the officers. They didn't give a fuck. The less officers there are, the less people that are intelligent enough to rise up against you and form, coup. Smart on his part, barbaric, on the other part. Now, Finland didn't have to happen this way. The original plan was to fucking just drive a few tank divisions up because they're fighting over Karelia, to just drive them basically to Helsinki in Finland. Now, that dude got sacked, if I remember correctly, and then they proposed a new plan, which was attack on every single front, and with just firepower everywhere, and that obviously led to a bloodbath. And then they went back to the original plan, which was drive a fucking spearhead division near Helsinki, and they'll give up, which they did. So yeah, the bloodbath of the Winter War was fucking immense for the Soviets. Now, 190,000 is nothing to the Soviet population, but in terms of military debt, that is a military dead and wounded. That is a massive.
Unsurprisingly, these revealed a shocking lack of initiative amongst Soviet commanders, embarrassingly poor coordination between units, a total inability to rapidly communicate with frontline troops, and massive logistical issues. Enormous reforms in both doctrine and equipment were required, but serious problems continued to go unaddressed. Chief among them were the political commissars, who held the power to execute officers for practically any reason. Given his
In that played a massive role in Finland. Like, hey, maybe we shouldn't charge that machine guns, we'll get shot. And then the commies start poisoning out, puts a fucking pistol to your head and says, you will charge that machine gun, or I'll fucking kill you right now. Yeah,
his extremely weak military position and the ease with which the clearly rotten Western democracies were failing beneath the heel of the German jackboot, Stalin realized he needed time to consolidate his gains and avoid additional bloodshed for now.
Now, this is an important fact. So, all of the communist parties around the world at this time were just basically loyal to the Soviets and were basically Stalinist. They listened to whatever came out of Moscow at this point. That includes German communist, French communist, Italian communist, Spanish communist, fucking everyone that's a communist, okay? They listened to Moscow. So, that's why there was no real French fucking resistance fighting from the communist side of France, which was actually a very big percentage of the French population, surprisingly big. They were told, don't rebel, even though they're in their own territory, and they listened to Moscow orders to not fucking rebel, because Moscow had ordered it. That's how deep this goes. Now, when the Germans do Operation Barbarossa, the Soviets are like, cool, everyone that's being occupied, you as communist, now you can fucking rise up. And that's what happens in France and Yugoslavia and everywhere else.
And avoid additional bloodshed for now. But this caused Stalin to become unhealthily obsessed with preserving peace with Germany. His belief that Hitler would not invade while at war with Great Britain was initially reasonable, but he clung to it far beyond the point of rationality, even rejecting intelligence from his own agents in Berlin and Tokyo. In a report from Lavrenti Beria regarding the prospect of an invasion, Stalin wrote, "You can tell your source from the German air headquarters that he can go and his mother. This is not a source, but disinformation."
And this is called Stalin's paranoia, and it gets bad. It gets real bad. During Barbarossa, he just basically fucking has a panic attack and locks himself in a room while his country's getting fucking attacked, and nobody has any orders to even defend themselves. So.
In a similar display of maturity, Stalin responded to the perfectly accurate reports from Agent Richard Sorge in Tokyo that 9 armies would attack the USSR on the 22nd of June by calling him a little. Stalin also believed that even if the unthinkable did happen, his existing defenses could hold out until a full mobilization. Said defenses consisted of a thin red line of divisions stretched across the vast Soviet border territories, all with orders never to retreat, and no radios to coordinate a retreat anyway.
Yep, basically all fucking true.
Fortunately, some officers of the Red Army foresaw the inevitable and risked their lives to prepare for a German attack. On May 15th, General Alexander Vasilevsky worked with Georgy Zhukov and Semyon Timoshenko to formulate a strategy that called for the Red Army to absorb the German attack and then counterattack to destroy the bulk of enemy forces and fight the war on foreign soil. The plan proposed a preemptive strike against the invasion force and requested Stalin permit a covert mobilization. Stalin either never read the plan or instantly rejected it.
No, either one could be fucking true. The result is the same. Red Army is not mobilized and gets absolutely dicked in Barbarossa.
But even experienced generals substantially underestimated the speed of the German buildup. And it was only on the 21st of June that Stalin finally issued an alert order, which reached the front lines a whole 1 hour before the attack began. Even in this last communique, Stalin showed his reluctance to believe the obvious by saying, "The task of our troops is not to respond to any provocative actions that might result in serious complications."
Which basically, in military jargon, is stand down, don't do fucking shit. Stay where you are, stand down, don't do anything to provoke them, don't take defensive positions, don't move. That's what that means. And you can see this is a problem. Again, 1 hour before the attack, even that response time could have done something if they had radios. A lot of planes were on the ground and they got absolutely fucking destroyed when Barbarossa happened. An alert order getting out, fucking crazy. Even a day, let alone even more hours, even 1 hour would have allowed some of the planes to get airborne to defend. Pearl Harbor didn't. Technically, they were warned, but you saw how that happened. And yeah, some of our planes actually did get in the air even during that attack. So
At 3:15 a.m. on the 22nd of June 1941, over 3 million German troops crashed through the Soviet border defenses with unstoppable force. The Red Army was caught in the middle of major reforms, and commanders failed to exercise even the most rudimentary coordination between infantry and artillery. Stalin himself was completely blindsided by the invasion and wasted precious hours entertaining the notion that it was all a hideous mistake. When he came to his senses, his first moves were to order the evacuation of Soviet industry to the Urals.
he didn't come out of the super for a good while. He locked himself in his room and he just refused to believe this was happening. Now, the evacuation of the factories to the Urals is actually not a bad plan. It actually has some foresight, considerable, but it does mean losing a lot of fucking ground. But if you pack the factories up, you can't lose them.
And establish a General Supreme Command, or Stavka, with himself at the top. But Stalin allegedly suffered a breakdown on the 28th after the fall of Minsk, and fled to his private residence outside of Moscow.
Nobody could fucking reach him.
After 2 whole days in solitude, a delegation of senior Soviet officials convinced him to return, whereupon he threw himself into organizing a series of massive counteroffensives, while doubling down on his policy of no retreat and no surrender. This culminated in Order 270, which read in part, "Those falling into encirclements are to fight to the last. Those who prefer to surrender are to be destroyed by all available means." The order was enforced by Stalin's political commissars, who were empowered to countermand the orders of operational commanders and administer summary executions without trial.
And you can see this is going to be a fucking problem if officers need to do their job and they're getting shot by commissars that disagree with them. Because remember, commissars are not military officers. None of these guys are trained at a military academy. They don't even have to know what the fuck is going on. They don't have to lead anybody. No, it's just political ideology. So if they think you're stupid, for example, let's take a modern day thing. Let's say, let's put it this way. Let's say you have a Trump supporter, then you have a Democrat supporter, okay? And then you have me. And I'm like, hey, we need to move the front line. And both of them are like, no, fuck you, you're just lying to us. And they shoot me. It ends in the same fucking way. They're got their positions from political appointments, not actual skill and really shit.
Of operational commanders and administer summary executions without trial. On July 3rd, he addressed his nation for the first time since the start of the invasion and called for a patriotic war. He also recognized the British as allies, declaring the conflict part of a united front of peoples standing for freedom. This speech
Freedom
marked a turning point in Stalin's attitudes, as he began to replace ideological sentiment with patriotism, emphasizing this as a grand struggle for the Soviet people rather than a battle between communism and fascism.
Because that was what it was for Hitler. It was a war of extermination, fascism versus communism.
Ironically enough, it was perhaps Hitler's unswerving dedication to the extermination of the Slavic people that helped Stalin power through his darkest moments, leaving him with a binary choice: accept certain death or fight as hard as possible to avert it.
Now that is true. It was a war of extermination over there. It's not like you could give up like France. No. Giving up like France means everybody in your family is going to die. That's not an option. So you fight to the last possible measure, which is what happened.
While Hitler's early victories convinced him that he was a military genius, Stalin's early defeats shook him back to a semblance of reality. Though he continued ordering failed counteroffensives throughout 1941, he also reached out to other Allied powers and began essential negotiations for supplies and military aid. These diplomatic overtures would be Stalin's greatest contribution to the war, ensuring that the Red Army had the international backing necessary to absorb the horrific early losses inflicted by Operation Barbarossa. However,
now that is true. The equipment definitely fucking helped. War winning? No, not really. We didn't really give them our best shit, let's be honest. We kind of gave them our secondhand crap, so.
it should not be assumed that Stalin was the source of all military issues within the USSR. Even at his worst, he did listen to advice from his generals, and many supported his tactical decisions. Even Georgy Zhukov wrote in his memoirs, "We did not think that our armed forces would be such a failure at the start of the war and suffer such serious defeats in the first battles that they would be forced to retreat into the interior of the country." And at that time, our military theoretical science generally did not consider the profound problems of strategic defense, mistakenly considering it not so important. The entire Soviet military command fully subscribed to the doctrine of offensive action, supported by mechanized units, and many supported Stalin's insistence on no retreat even from obviously hopeless battles. Many officers were also obsessed with the idea of avoiding defeatism, which led to absurd scenarios like General Kliment Voroshilov refusing a massive food convoy for the besieged city of Leningrad because it gave the impression that the city was undersupplied.
Yeah. Again, people didn't have to die. But people died because of shit like that without.
As the Germans began knocking at the gates of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Leningrad, marshals like Zhukov, Timoshenko, and Vasilevsky were busy reinventing the core doctrines of the Red Army. Air power was concentrated into large, centrally coordinated air armies that could flexibly respond to a rapidly evolving strategic situation, while ground forces were finally freed from the oppressive hand of the political commissars in September of 1942. Promotion by merit was resumed, as was the distribution of medals for valorous conduct.
Not only that, also the promotion, the ability to actually have officers. So back in Yi Day, so back when the revolution started, there was no such thing as officers, there was comrades. You are my comrade. Now, comrades would vote for their officers. This happened, okay? They figured out during the Russian Revolution, that's not really a good fucking idea. Because maybe they know what they're doing and maybe they don't. It's just a popularity contest. Now, this reintroducing medals of heroism and stuff is a very good thing on morale. Again, you have to think that everyone is equal in the society. It's a little strange when you, basically any Western society, it's a little strange when you think everyone is equal. I mean, everyone's not equal. Let's not kid ourselves. In the societies, no one is equal to Stalin but Stalin, so.
To shore up morale and prevent desertions, veteran blocking detachments were stationed in the rear of Soviet divisions. These blocking detachments were examples of morale and discipline to nervous conscripts, as they detained fleeing soldiers, operated as emergency reserves, and restored the cohesion of routing units.
Exactly. They did not fucking gun their own people down like in Enemy at the Gates. They didn't do that. Veteran troops in the back line, some commissars to be like, hey, stop, I need you to turn around and regain your morale. We're not going to shoot you, but you need to fucking stop.
On a strategic level, the Red Army embraced the concept of deep operations, which contrasted the German Blitzkrieg by emphasizing large-scale combined arms warfare across a vast front.
Now, this is called deep battle. This is a doctrine that Russia still uses today. They tried it in Ukraine, didn't fucking work because they forgot how it actually works. But basically, when you hit a line, so deep battle is the following. Blitzkrieg is their own thing that we'll talk about, but blah, 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 long story there. Deep battle is the principle of the following. You're going to hit a line, okay? This line is going to have certain strong points in it whenever you hit it. So what you do in this case is you prick it with several spear points until you find a gap. So prick, 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 gap. Okay, gap is found. Now, with all of your reserves, you send them through the gap that you have found and punch through. That is what deep battle is, and you keep up with the penetrations, and basically you just keep doing that.
Depleting enemy reserves and exhausting their logistical capabilities. Commanders like Zhukov and Vasilevsky also became masters of maskirovka, an institutionalized art of deception and misinformation that sought to fool German armies as to the size and intent of their Soviet counterpart. This strategy was enhanced by Stalin's diplomatic efforts, granting access to the Allied code-breaking network and vital insight into German strategic intentions.
Yeah, that is true. There's a lot of spy shenanigans going on between British communists and the Soviets. Let's put it that way. The Soviets were communists were everywhere. They were in every major research facility that the Allies had going. The Allies didn't like that, and they refused to admit that that was a thing. But Stalin got the bomb in '48. So yeah, there's a lot of double spying going on with communists, even though they were allies.
Another common myth about the Red Army is its reliance on chaotic human wave tactics to drown out their qualitatively superior German foes. The truth is much more nuanced. First, rifles and other small arms were plentiful. Men were not sent in without a weapon against fortified positions.
Now that is true. That is fucking wasteful of human. That's just retarded. You just give them a rifle. Again, sending a guy that has no experience with a rifle is basically fucking worthless. All he's really doing is eating food and running away.
As movies and games like to depict. And though mass assault tactics were used in some capacity, it was as a last resort when all other options were unavailable.
This is true. The Soviets preferred to bombard the ever-living shit out of a position first. If that didn't work, then they'd have other means, and then finally it would be a mass human wave. That would be the last resort. That's why the Soviets love their artillery. They have a lot of fucking artillery. Even today, they still have a lot of their old guns stored up. Basically, this is why. Mass firepower.
And the instant that the Red Army adopted the radio, improving coordination, they all but ceased to occur.
That is true, mostly. The radios were a really big thing for Russia, mostly because they could actually observe their fire and adjust. So beforehand, an infantry regiment is assigned to take a position. There are bunkers on that position. So before the battle, the artillery guys, or the infantry dudes, are going to be like, hey, I need you to bombard this position. Okay, artillery's like, copy that. We'll bombard this position at 8 p.m. or 8 a.m. as soon as you start your attack. They attack. Now, the Germans bring up reinforcements up on the hill, and they need to shift fire. They can't do that because there is no guy with a radio that can be like, hey, an artillery needs to shift fire. Later in the war, they start getting guys with artillery observers, and those guys have radios that can call back to the artillery and adjust fire. But that's, again, later, and it's massive improvement because of the radios.
Furthermore, deep operation warfare emphasized the grand strategic picture rather than the outcome of individual battles. Therefore, if the Red Army suffered technical defeats in 10 minor battles, but inflicted enough losses on the German army to keep it from winning one decisive engagement, the Red Army retained an overall strategic advantage. The one doctrine the Soviet leadership had kept sacred throughout its tumultuous early years was that of total mobilization, alongside the absolute prioritization of military recruitment and production. This attitude paid dividends during the war, as it enabled combat losses to be replaced at a phenomenal rate, further adding to the illusion that the USSR had a bottomless well of manpower. In reality, the German army had a numerical advantage in Operation Barbarossa, and the scales only tipped toward the Red Army after 1941.
Now that is true. There's a whole thing you could go on about how Hitler and Goering and all those guys, what they learned from World War I, the people will give up before the military. Now, this is why the calorie intake of Germans was very high during the entire war. Now, they stripped all of this food from literally everybody else, so all of those people were starving, but the German people were relatively well fed during the war. Now, this is because during World War I, they didn't have any food, and the population just gave up because they were literally all starving to death. So, Germany wanted to avoid complete mobilization of their entire economy to war, okay? They thought their people would give up on them. The Soviets, on the other hand, it was a revolutionary spirit of the people, right? They didn't actually get to Moscow, the Germans. The Russian people just kind of got sick of, being ordered to die over and over again. And they went down the path of total mobilization, which is easier to do in a totalitarian government of the Soviets. And the totalitarian government had been in place since really 1920. You could even go 1923-ish after Lenin dies. The Germans, the Nazi Germany, was only in 1933, so a bit longer of time for the Soviets to get their ideological things in place to order a massive mobilization of everyone.
Throughout most of the war, the Red Army failed to meet the 3-to-1 numerical advantage most military thinkers believe necessary to counter a defender's advantage.
Now that is true. Usually you want 3-to-1 odds when you're attacking a position to have a really decent chance of breaking through. Also, this is a famous photograph. Also, that man died shortly after that photograph being taken, which is sad.
Yet was still able to wage the largest offensive war in history. Many reports also conflate numbers of active personnel with reservists, who hadn't even been called up yet. Only by early 1943 did the Red Army outnumber the Wehrmacht, and by the time the Soviet tanks rolled into Berlin, this advantage had reached 4-to-1. By late 1944, the Red Army had reached its zenith. While Hitler was busy micromanaging his forces, reassigning generals on a whim, and generally interfering at every level of military operations, Stalin had relaxed his grip on the reins of power just enough to let his now veteran officers prosecute the war as they saw fit.
Yes, more or less. Now, he did tell Zhukov and Ivan Kuznetsov, I believe, the second guy, that was a part of that whole front towards Berlin. Stalin's like, whoever gets to Berlin first maybe gets promoted to field marshal, or maybe gets like something out of this. So he'd make officers compete with each other for literally no fucking reason. A lot of people died because of that, but yeah, fuck.
Soviet offensives now began with careful planning and deception, followed by an initial wave of attacks that seized key positions and compromised the integrity of the whole enemy defensive network. These initial thrusts were accompanied by titanic artillery barrages and vast air attacks that rolled ahead of the main advance, while mass tank formations punched holes through the disordered enemy lines. Soviet field officers were now able to race their forces through the resulting salients and respond to emerging threats with speed and discipline. The Battle of Kursk was the perfect example of all these new ideas coming to fruition, involving extensive campaigns of deception to fool the Germans into striking at heavily reinforced sections of the Soviet line, while vast tank and infantry columns tore across the open steppe under a sky full of ground attack aircraft. Now,
kind of. The Soviets were able to fucking reinforce their position because the German generals, actually did want to attack, but Hitler's like, no, we must wait for new tanks. And a whole bunch of other shit, which gave initiative away, and the Soviets knew the attack was coming, so of course it would fail. Kursk aside, the Red Army in 43, 44, 45 was actually a very good fighting force. I would say amazing, but I would say good. And they did win against the Germans. It's not like the Germans were like, oh, yes, we'll win every battle. No, they're going to get their ass beat.
This new, dynamic approach to warfare would enable such feats as the lightning invasion of Manchuria, a brilliantly coordinated assault across a virtually unindustrialized landmass.
Which I did a video on, and I highly recommend you go check that out. At the very end of the video, I'll link the playlist, but yeah.
Soviet forces penetrating as deep as the Korean Peninsula in less than 2 weeks.
And that was just the 30-day campaign that happened there. Was one of the most brilliant military strategies that's ever happened.
The USSR presents a fascinating case study into a nation that entered the largest conflict in human history in perhaps the worst position possible. Ruled by a paranoid autocrat with practically no military experience, the Soviet Union paid a huge price during Operation Barbarossa and continued seeing defeats well into early 1943. But with each loss, the Red Army learned from its mistakes, methodically planning how to get the most use out of every individual soldier. Stalin also learned to trust his military commanders to do their job without micromanagement, something his Nazi counterpart never grasped. The Red Army went from a state of near anarchy at the start of the conflict to inflicting the overwhelming majority of German casualties and swiftly invading Japanese Manchuria in only 10 days.
That is true. As he said, Hitler was he meddled in his officers a lot. Okay, now the reason he if you watch Downfall, he's like, I should have liquidated all the officers, like Stalin did, but he didn't. That did come to bite him in the ass, more or less. At least he thought. Stalin sacked all of his guys and got rid of them. And look what happened in Barbarossa because of So that's the end of the video. Hope you enjoyed my commentary. If you go up there, and there should be a playlist to check out more of the Armchair Historian from the reactions I've done, if you want to go check that out. Otherwise, leave your comments and I shall read them. I will see you people next time, and we shall continue on.